Our company has a policy that the moment somebody is hired, they need to go through orientation first. Once they go through orientation, then they can become an active employee. Currently, everybody with us has been through orientation, but we're getting ready to hire somebody new. And the moment we insert them, we want their status to always be set to orientation. Now, we'll update it a couple days or weeks later once they've completed the orientation. So let's set up a default constraint to do this. Let's type alter table, and let's alter the employee table, and we're going to add a constraint, and we'll call it df underscore employee underscore status, which is based off the name of the field that we're going to set this default constraint on. The default value will be orientation, and that is going to be for the status field. And I'm delimiting that in square brackets because status is also a keyword. All right, let's run this. Command's completed successfully. Now, we're getting ready to use this for the first time by inserting into the employee table the following values for your 15th employee. And you know what? While we're doing this, let's look at the data in the employee table right now and match it up. Okay, the last employee was 14, so this next employee will be employee 15. The employee's last name will be Jones. The first name will be Tess, and they will be hired on the current time that we run this statement. So we'll say current underscore timestamp. And the location will be location 1, which is the Seattle location. She will work for Sally, which is manager ID number 11. And the status we're going to set to default. The hired offset will be set to null. We'll update that value later. And the time zone for her will be -08 GMT. So let's run this insert statement. It says 1 row affected. And let's look at what we've got for this 15th employee. It's Des Jones. Notice the status was set to orientation. Well, this was great. We know all inserts will always start off with orientation. The record can be changed later through normal processes. Sometimes we will actually use a default for a record that is most likely going to be the case, and we can always overwrite the default during our insert with an explicit value. For example, what would you say if I were to change this 0800 to default? Why? Most of our locations are in that time zone, and those are our biggest locations. Yeah, every once in a while we will hire somebody who's not in that time zone, but we could always explicitly put those values in. In order to make this a reality, we're going to have to create another default constraint, and it's going to look like this. Let's alter the table employee, and we're going to add a constraint, and we'll call it df for default underscore employee underscore time zone, because it'll be on the time zone field. The default will be -08 GMT, and we're going to do that for the field called time zone. Okay, let's give that a run. It says completed successfully. Now let's test it out by inserting another employee. This will be employee number 16, who is Nancy Biggs. And we're going to use the current timestamp, location 1 for manager 11. We're going to put default for the status because she's in orientation. And we'll put null for the hired offset, and then default for the time zone. Run your insert statement. Now let's look at our table. Select star from employee, shows us that we have 16 records. Here's Nancy Biggs, and over here we see her time zone is set to -0800. You may notice that for every employee, we store their hire date as well as a combination of their hire date and their time zone. The field for that is called hired offset, but I didn't populate it with any records for those last 2 employees, hoping somebody else will update it later. Well, let's go ahead and update that. Let's say update employee, and we will set the hire date offset to be equal to date time offset from the hire date based on the time zone. And I'll do that where all of them are currently null. So those ones get updated. All right, let's run this. 2 rows are affected. Great, everything's in place. Now, you can probably understand why I don't want to put this complicated formula inside of one entity of an insert statement. Well, that's another purpose of the default constraint, is to make coding of predictable values a lot easier for reuse. So let's do that. Let's alter the table employee, and we will add the constraint called df underscore employee underscore hired offset. And the default value will be this complicated formula of 2 datetime offset based on the current timestamp based on -0800 for the time zone. Now again, if you're in a different time zone, you're going to have to use a different value. So we're going to say that's for the hired date offset. Let's run this. Okay, so how do we put it to use? Well, let's insert into the employee table the following values. Employee 17, which is Wendy Downs, and we'll put current timestamp for the regular hire date. We'll say they're in location 1, working for manager 11. We'll put default, so they go in orientation. Now we're going to put default for the hired date offset, and we're also going to put default for the time zone. Let's run this, and let's see what we've got. Look what was automatically entered: the orientation status, the hire date offset, and the time zone. Defaults are great, but sometimes you don't want that value. Let's look at the employee table again, and let's look at our last 2 records. Now, we know why status came up as orientation, because we fed in default. And hired offset was fed by default, and time zone was fed by default. Well, what if we don't want default for orientation? What if we're just putting in a test record, and we put in a special note in there called hired delayed? We're not supposed to go to orientation yet because everything's still pending. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to feed the default for hired offset and time zone, but we're going to explicitly choose a value for the status field, which is the third to the last field in our insert statement. So let's do that. Let's go insert into employee, and let's use the following values. Let's say employee 98. Yeah, we know we should probably use 18, but this is a record that we want to identify as a test record, so we're going to insert a record that is easily identified that doesn't fit in with the others, because we're going to delete it later. So this employee's last name will be test98. Their first name will be insert record 98. The current timestamp will be their hire date. The location will be 1, and it will be manager 11. And we'll say hire delayed instead of using orientation for status. Now let's use the default for the hired offset and the time zone. Let's run this insert statement. 1 row affected. Now, let's select just that record to see what we've got. Select all records from employee where empid equals 98. Notice it says hire delayed and not orientation. Well, this has worked out pretty well, having default values for several fields where we can pretty much predict what the next records are going to be. How do you remove default values if you no longer need them? For example, this status field shouldn't have any more defaults. And this hired offset, that should not have any more defaults. Well, let's do the same alter table statement, but this time we will drop the constraint. Now, what constraint are we going to drop? Maybe we forgot the name. Well, let's expand tables. Let's expand employee. Let's expand columns. And the status field, what's it got? Well, let's look under constraints. And there's a default constraint called df underscore employee underscore status. Let's drop that. Let's run this statement. It says commands completed successfully. This must be gone. Yep, it's gone. Let's do the same thing for the DF employee hired offset. Alter table DBO employee drop DF underscore employee underscore hired offset and go. Commands completed successfully. Now, it doesn't affect the existing records in your table. This is just defaults for new updates or inserts. Well, let's do a new insert. Let's go insert into employee. The following values. Employee number 99, which we'll call as test 99, and we'll say insert record 99. We're going to use the current timestamp as we did before. We're going to say they're in location 1, which is Seattle. They're working for manager 11. Now, we don't have a default constraint for the status field anymore. What happens if you put default for that field? And default for the hired offset? And the last field does. We'll put default for that one too. Let's run this. It says one row affected, so it took our update. Let's see what the employee table looks like with that very last record. It put a null for status and a null for hired offset. In other words, if you don't have a default constraint on a field and you use the default keyword to do an insert or an update, the default is then null. Lab 1.3, Skill Check 1. Create a default constraint named df underscore employee underscore location ID that sets the default for the location ID field of the employee table to 1. Skill Check 2. Create a default constraint that sets the unit discount field for the sales invoice detail table to 0. Use proper naming conventions for this constraint. Skill Check 3. Create a default constraint that sets the order date field of the sales invoice table to the current date and time using the current timestamp property.